Hello, my name is Tom Staunton, and in this session, I'm going to continue to look at some stuff to do with the Introduction to Career Development module as part of the Career Leaders course here at the University of Derby. In this, we're going to recap some of the stuff that we looked at on the course to do with information and how we use information in career delivery, and some stuff around an exercise around the Gatsby benchmarks. There's quite a few exercises for you to look at as part of this session, so I'm going to give you some questions that you could go away and use yourself when maybe developing your assignment. So off we go. So assessing your program. We're going to look at two aspects of this. Firstly, to do with how information is used as part of your program, and also how you're responding to the Gatsby benchmarks as part of your program. So the first thing I'd encourage you to think through is how is information used as part of your program. Information comes into the Gatsby benchmarks in a number of different areas, mainly Benchmark 2, which is to do with learning from labour market information, but it's also implied through a number of the other benchmarks. So I think these could be useful questions for anybody to be asking. What routes are available to your students? Are you aware of the various routes that somebody could go to when they leave your institution? How do you stay up to date on these? So for maybe some newer things like T-levels or apprenticeships or training providers, how are you staying up to date on those potential options for your students? And then how do you share this with students and students' guardians? What do you do to make sure that they are aware of the options available to them? So some questions for you to be thinking through by yourself. Next, it's helpful to spend a bit of time thinking about how do you gather information yourself and make use of that as part of your program. This can come under sort of assessing provision. Kirkpatrick, 1994, I think it's very helpful for looking at various ways that you can assess programs. Kirkpatrick talks about 4 levels of assessment. Now, the 4 levels aren't necessarily superior to each other, but that they are, as the diagram shows, they're linked to each other, and they tend to occur at different periods of time. So level 1, reaction, this is what people think immediately after they've received some provision from a training program. This is kind of the comment in the corridor after the lesson. This is what you say over coffee at the end of the training session. This is sort of stuff that often gets gathered in tick sheets and sort of smiley sheets at the end of sessions. It can be really helpful, but it's important to think about that sort of information is just somebody's initial reaction, what they kind of think immediately after receiving the session. Secondly, if you've what you'd hope is after time isn't just that people enjoyed a particular session, but they've actually learned from it. So level 2 is a bit further down the line in terms of time than somebody's initial reaction. But it's kind of like trying to assess, have somebody actually gained new information? Has what they've learned from the session stuck? Do they actually think differently about their career? Are they aware of new options? Are they thinking about what they can do about their career in different terms? So level 2 is asking, has some learning actually occurred? Level 3 is then behaviour. On the whole, you don't want people just to learn stuff for its own sake, but you want people to put that learning into practice and do specific things differently. So it looks at the behaviours that are involved, or that you'd want to have involved from the session. So maybe somebody's learnt about apprenticeships as an option. Well, have they put that into practice by actually applying for some apprenticeships? Maybe you've taught them about the importance of keeping their options open and being flexible. Well, are they behaving differently about their career, or are they showing more flexibility in some way? So level 3 is about asking what sort of behaviours do you really want? And for behaviours to really exist, you need to wait a decent period of time to see whether those have actually sort of settled down and people are actually behaving differently in their careers. And then the 4th and final level is to do with results. If people have learnt stuff and have behaved differently, you would hope that would lead to a particular set of results. Behaviours tend to have much value in and of themselves, but are most important if they lead to somebody actually achieving something that they wouldn't have got at before. So hopefully you can see these 4 levels happen over different periods of time. There's a difference between somebody's initial reaction and the results that they have from that learning. that they're linked to each other, that reaction leads into learning, learning leads into behavior, behavior leads into results. And you probably need to think about assessing in terms of assessing bits of all of them. What can be a temptation is that people often gather information initially about how somebody's reacted to a session, and then they gather information about the overall results, which they might get through in destination figures a couple of years after somebody's left a school, but without looking at the middle stuff, learning and behaviours, which I'd see as the areas which often get overlooked. It can be difficult to link reaction to results. So you might have an idea that people were generally happy about the delivery they received from a careers programme, and you can see the results they've gone into, but it's not always easy to join those two things up. It's by looking at learning, seeing what people are actually learning from your program, and looking at behaviours, seeing if they're putting that learning into practice and behaving differently, that you can start to actually build up a picture of why you have the results you'd have. So I think Kirkpatrick can be very helpful for people trying to think through what they're actually going to, what's actually happened as part of their program, and looking at all those different levels, thinking about how you might assess all of those different stages. Particularly looking at learning and behaviour has often overlooked areas. So, some other questions for you to work through. So thinking at the moment, what information do you gather about your students? How could you use this to assess provision? So which of those levels from Kirkpatrick might it fit into? And then if you were to assess your provision better, what other information do you think you might need to gather, and how would you go about getting a hold of that? So a couple of points just around information and some things for you to be thinking through. And then the last sort of exercise for you to look at is just some stuff around the benchmarks. Got a quick exercise. Maybe you want to pause the video and do this yourself now. Just a quick question around it. Can you name all 8 Gatsby benchmarks? Just the top of your head, without referring to anybody else, can you name all 8? Maybe you just want to pause the video and have a look at that exercise now. So there are the answers. There are the 8 benchmarks. A helpful thing to do with those benchmarks might be to think about doing a SWOT analysis. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So if you look back at those 8 benchmarks, what are your strengths in terms of your careers program? Which ones are you doing best at? And what are your weaknesses? Which ones are you doing less well at? Then particularly if you look at those weaknesses, what opportunities do you have to improve things? What could you do to make your response to those benchmarks better? And what threats do you face? What things might get in the way that you might need to mitigate in some way? So I would suggest doing that sort of SWOT analysis might be a helpful way to think through your program. So a couple of a few exercises there, a few things to be thinking about that you might want to bring into your assignment. How are you using information part of your program? How are you assessing your program? And if you look at the benchmarks as a whole, what sort of a SWOT analysis would you end up looking at? And then just another final exercise, just thinking about what you could maybe just focus on one particular benchmark that's most important to you. Think about what difference would improving it make, and how would you tell? Maybe think about back to the stuff from Kirkpatrick and assessment when considering that. So there's the reference from Kirkpatrick. So point of this session is just to have a few questions to start really getting you thinking about your program to set you up for the assignment that I'm going to talk about in the next video.